Hi everyone, welcome to this webinar on the IPBES Values Guide. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Håkon da Silva Hyldmo and I will guide you through today's session. Today's webinar is the fourth webinar of the IPBES Webinar Series, delivered to you by the IPBES Task Force and Technical Support Unit on Capacity Building. Through the IPBES Webinar Series, we offer webinar sessions aiming to build capacities for those involved in and wanting to learn more about IPBES. A total of 10 webinars have been tentatively planned as part of the series during 2016. Information about upcoming webinars will be posted on the events calendar on ipbes.net and distributed via email. The recordings and the PDF presentations from all the webinars in the series will be posted on www.ipbes.net/webinars, where you can access them freely. Before moving on to Patricia's presentation, apologies for that, I have a few points on housekeeping for today's session. We will not interrupt the presentation for questions, but we will have a facilitated Q&A session in the second half of the webinar. If you have any questions you'd like to ask Patricia in the Q&A session, you can submit these during the presentation using the toolbar facility in the GoToWebinar interface on your screen. We have, in addition to Patricia, been lucky enough to be joined by Mr. David Gonzalez from the IPBES Technical Support Unit on Values. David will join us in answering any questions you might have concerning the Values Guide and practical and technical issues concerning the webinar, which we will do in writing during the webinar session. I would like to say as well that as there are close to 250 registered attendees for the webinar, I hope you will understand if you're not able to cover all incoming questions. If you after this webinar session have any questions or comments concerning the webinar series or the work of the IPBES Task Force and Technical Support Unit on Capacity Building, please feel free to send us your questions via email to tsu.capacitybuilding@ipbes.net. Once the webinar ends, we hope you will take 30 seconds of your time to answer a survey about the webinar to help us continue to improve the webinar series. The survey will pop up on your screen once the webinar ends. With that, I would now like to hand over to our presenter to begin today's session. Good luck, Patricia. We are looking forward to your presentation. Patricia, let me just say that at the moment we cannot hear you. I think now.
This is fine.
Yeah. Good luck.
Yeah. So I would. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone, depending on where you are on the planet. It is really a pleasure for me to share with you the work we have been doing on the Values Guide to all of you. I would like first to start with putting the context on how was the work on the Values Guide started. Continuations of this work were approved during the third plenary when the document was assessed, and it was considered important to further strengthen the document. The final version of the guide was then approved during IPBES 4. Although this is a preliminary guide, no further amendments will be made to the document. Currently, this guide is being integrated into the regional, thematic, and global IPBES assessments. Well, from the onstart of IPBES conceptual framework, multiple values were already addressed. This figure shows this conceptual framework, and I want to highlight in the three important foci of IPBES, which are nature, nature's benefit to people, and good quality of life. You can see that there are three colors for the letter. In black, you have a generic name for the box, for example, nature. In green, it is referring to, say, the more scientific way to refer to this. For example, ecosystem goods and services. And in blue, you have a very different denomination that comes from the context of indigenous or local knowledge, like living in harmony with nature. So this framework was already aware of this diverse conceptualization of nature to people in good quality of life. And throughout this seminar and on the values guide, we will emphasize on the values of these three important foci of nature, nature's benefit to people, and good quality of life. But why would IPBES worry about investing so much time and energy on assessing these diverse values? Well, because there are very different worldviews. Very different worldviews mean that what we understand as what is real or not real, what is true or not true, and what is knowledge is perceived in very different ways in different contexts and in these different worldviews. In the same way, nature's benefit to people and the contribution to a good quality of life are perceived and valued in starkly different ways, and sometimes these can be conflicting. Such diversity derives from different worldviews about how the society and nature relationship occurs. Then, recognizing, understanding, and assessing this diversity is needed to raise awareness of its implication on the behavior of individuals, communities, and societies, to make visible the wide spectrum of values, and to permit recognition of and respect for the values of all individuals, communities, and social entities, very especially on those who are at risk of being disenfranchised by the outcomes of decision-making. It can also be very important to design and conduct assessments that explicitly take into account this diversity, and certainly will contribute to design management and policy interventions that are consistent with stakeholder values and thus do not undermine the very functions those decisions seek to accomplish. So in order to show you what we gain from this perspective, I would like to use a heuristic example to contrast what happens under a single and multiple worldviews. On the left panel, we have focused on single worldviews. And these single worldviews can be focused on different things. It can be emphasize economic development. It can emphasize the conservation of biodiversity or ecosystem functioning. It can emphasize social demands and poverty alleviation, or it can emphasize the maintenance of cultural diversity and indigenous knowledge. But in this case, we have chosen to focus on an economic-dominated valuation perspective. On the other hand, we have diverse valuation, diverse worldviews. So when we compare these two, we can see that the fossil value in an economic-dominated valuation emphasizes this nature's benefit to people as an important part of the economic process. On the other hand, these three foci, nature's benefit to people and good quality of life, are equally important. When we think about policy objectives on the economic-dominated valuation, economic objectives are much more important than environmental and social, while in diverse valuation, they would be equally important. Also, from the perspective of valuation, in an economic-dominated one, the emphasis, of course, is in economic valuation and largely in market valuation. Instead, in diverse perspective, there will be an integrated valuation that would take into account biophysical, sociocultural, economic, health, and holistic perspectives. In terms of the values, in an economic perspective, the emphasis would be on market and somehow to non-market values, with some indicators of green accounting or poverty indicators. Whereas in the diverse perspective, all these biophysical, sociocultural, economic, health, and holistic values of coming from a wide range of actors would be recognized, integrated, and bridged. From the perspective of policy support tools, the emphasis on the economic perspective would be cost-benefit analysis, whereas in diverse perspective, we would be thinking about tools such as participatory impact assessments. With respect to policy instruments, on the economic perspective, the emphasis will be on economic incentives, while on a diverse perspective, we would have inclusive and transparent decisions that would lead to policy integration and to partnership and shared responsibilities. These two perspectives have, of course, profound implications on the structuring of institutions and governance. So, starting from this perspective of the implications of having a diverse valuation perspective, we want to start by clarifying a few terms. What do we mean by value? Well, a value can express a principle or core belief. It can express a preference someone has for something, a particular state of the world. It can express the importance of something for itself or for other things, or just a measure. Let me give you an example. We are going to focus on the case of the bonobo, which is a pygmy chimpanzee that lives in tropical forests and its interaction with forest dwellers. So, for example, if we're thinking about a measure of nature, we will be thinking of area in hectares of tropical forests within which bonobos are found. If we're thinking about the importance of nature's benefit, we would be thinking about the contribution of the carbon stored in tropical forests to global stocks and thus to climate change regulation. It would be thinking about preferences from a good quality of life. We would emphasize maybe the interest in maintaining bonobos as a charismatic species. Whereas in principle, we would be really thinking about the right of bonobos or living in harmony with nature. And there's a major problem because these four meanings are often conflated and they are not easily teased apart. On the other hand, we want to show how nature's benefit to people and good quality of life are valued in very diverse ways. So what we have done is to put together a graphical way to show these with a range of examples come from very different lines of thought, very different worldviews, very different approaches, just to give a flavor of this diversity. So we start on the left part of the panel by dividing these three foci of nature of value. So we can value nature, nature's benefit to people, or good quality of life. Then we start identifying the types of values. So nature is attributed intrinsic value. This means these intrinsics are attributed to something as an end in itself, regardless of its utility for human ends. This means that these values are non-anthropocentric. They're centered on something other than human beings. But when we come to nature's benefit to people and good quality of life, we are talking about anthropocentric values, which we value something that has something in terms of its contribution to human beings and human purposes. So it is human-centered. These anthropocentric values can be divided into instrumental and relational value, and I would like to emphasize that there's a gradient. There's not a sharp division between which ones correspond to each of these. Instrumental values are attributed to something as a means to achieve a particular end, while relational values are relative to the meaningfulness of the relationships, including relationship between individuals and societies, individuals with nature, and with other different aspects of the world. So, for example, if we think in the top right panel about non-anthropocentric values of nature, we could either emphasize individual organism, biophysical processes, and then we would be thinking about sentient beings, their welfare rights, the evolution, ecosystem function. If we're thinking about nature's benefit to people, we would be thinking about nature's ability to supply services, for example. We'll be thinking about habit for fisheries, biodiversity, and future options. Then, if we think about a good quality of life, we'll be thinking about relational values. And among these relational values, we'll be thinking about security, livelihoods, living in harmony with nature. And so we'll be thinking about physical, mental, and health, or a sense of place or agency. The complexity is even further in the fact that all these very diverse values change. They change across contexts depending on people's subjectivity, environmental context, sociocultural and political context, and the institutions that carry them or facilitate their articulation. They change across scales. Spatial scales, from local to global, time scales, changing from past to present and into the future, and from the perspective of the social organization, in the scaling from individuals to the globe. These values also change when considering potential or future values. Including diverse values is not only very complex by itself, but it's really not the purpose of this guide. But the issue is that it is challenging to include them into policy design. Why is it challenging? Because these diverse and plural valuables are incommensurable. They cannot be easily compared like apples to apples. They're rather like apples to oranges, or rather apples to elephants. They cannot be easily summarized then, because of this very different nature, into a single metric. And it's very hard to compare the value of the contribution, say, for a spiritual contributions to their contributions to the economic development. So, because different stakeholders have different worldviews and different values, then it should be, all these values should be integrated in an equitable way, being inclusive of all actors that bear these differential cost benefits of any decisions and responsibilities. And also, it's very important to be mindful of power relations among these actors and pay particular attention to site-specific knowledge and indigenous local knowledge. How can we deal then with this complexity of diverse values, diverse fossil values, all these values changing and their complexity? Well, a plurality of values requires a plurality of evaluation methods. And it's very important to consider that methods themselves are value-laden. They, by their very nature, they emphasize particular methods, particular values with respect to others. And so making methodological choices, whether we are aware it or not, is really a political choice. So that means that we need transparent approaches to evaluations that can capture and make available knowledge of such diversity to stakeholders. Also, valuation outcomes can then be mainstreamed into policy design. So, in order to help understand this complexity and use it into different valuation and decision-making context, and particularly in the context of IPBES assessment, in the values we suggest a step-by-step approach. Before we go into this approach, I would like to point you to resources you can find within the guide to understand the step-by-step approach a bit further. In Chapter 2, we described at length all these concepts of values I have very quickly showed you. In Chapter 3, we describe valuation methodologies, and we really describe each of these steps in much detail, but also make a revision of all the different methods available for these different steps and what are the differences between them. In Chapter 4, we have identified data sources as well as knowledge needs and gaps. So if you need information on potential data sources, you can go there. Chapter 5, we have made examples of how this values guide could be integrated into regional or thematic assessments. So you can go to these examples to have some idea of how this could work. Chapter 6, we identify capacity building needs and thus what we need to do in order to understand better all these issues. And in Chapter 5, we describe policy support tools in methodologies and instruments for the explicit integration of diverse values. So let's go to this step-by-step approach. Step number 1 is identifying the purpose. Second, scoping. Third, methods. 4, synthesizing. 5th, communication. And 6, reviewing. Let's go in detail into each of these. Number 1, purpose. We need to identify the purpose of the valuation or assessment exercise for these diverse values. Is it to support decision making? Just to raise awareness? For doing accounting of, for instance, nature's contribution, or for conflict resolution? So in IPBES assessment, it's important to identify the purpose, to establish clear boundaries for the assessment process. And the kinds of questions you could ask yourself, so we could ask ourselves, is what worldviews are involved and what issues are at stake? What scale or scales are relevant and how do they interact? Does the team have the expertise required to address the worldviews and scales involved? Which values are associated with nature, nature's benefit to people, and the contribution to a good quality of life? And what is the possible scope of values that may be relevant in this assessment? Step number 2, scoping. Scoping is identifying the limits of the assessment or the evaluation process. So once we understand worldviews, which ones will we choose, the different fossil values, which ones are we taking into account, which types of values, at which scale, what kind of social engagement are we thinking about, what kind of a broader social context is this assessment or evaluation into, and other practical considerations. Remember that the choice of valuation methods is not a neutral decision. Address scoping considerations before choosing valuation methods, information sources, and integrative approaches. These considerations will help us make IPBES assessments comprehensive. So some guidelines for doing so is to be deliberative and expansive, looking for research that includes these diverse values and worldviews, including all the indigenous and local knowledge, So we really need to go beyond standard peer-reviewed papers published in English. We need to be sure to include policy relevance question for the specific assessment and identify which values are most appropriate to informing this literature research process. And it's important to make arguments for your approach very explicit. Third step is methods. Valuation methods for valuation are very diverse. They can emphasize biophysical, cultural and social, economic, health, or holistic ILK values. Also, we might want to value state or changes in nature or nature's benefits or good quality of life, but also of the aggregation of these different dimensions. So the choice of method is a critical part of this process and is an important determinant of the outcome. A heterogeneity of valuation methods will reflect a diversity and plurality of values if they're adequately integrated into IPBES assessments. So here it might be important to be mindful of values, valuation perspectives, and evaluated methods included in the different information sources. It will be important to recognize synthesis and integration of diverse values or values perspectives. Are values being aggregated? Are they upscaled? And to identify gaps within individual sources and from the collected body of knowledge. It will be important to gather information about the interpretation of values in data sources. This means what types of implications are derived from the values documented in the existing data, and also to synthesize and evaluate what you have found in each of the studies, describe gaps and their implications. 4, if we have diverse values, then we need somehow to integrate them, or at least to bridge among them, and sometimes it will be important to upscale them. So tools such as deliberation, integrated modeling, multi-criteria analysis, or narrative analysis can help. These integration approaches aim to aggregate valuation results into a unique outcome. But sometimes, rather than aggregating them, we want to show how they are different. So scaling up values in space or time, say for specific places or periods, can also be desirable, but it's not always feasible because very different valuation methods are relevant at different scales. Information on diverse values can be synthesized using these tools. The confidence limits to the valuation refer to errors from values available in the literature, the level of synthesis, taking into account the number of studies, and the limits of scope with respect to the initial scoping considerations. Step 5. Once we have the valuation or the assessment, we need to communicate to the public and decision-making. So we could report on values, the valuation process, as well as the confidence limits, and inform decision-making. So the way we can communicate on this can be very diverse. It can be quantitative, narrative, visual, or even performative ways to show these diverse values. It will be important to be mindful of what are the implications on the policy relevant questions for the assessment. How do these results of values inform scenarios? What are the implications of having incomplete information on values? What are the confidence limits based on what we found and the gaps we identified? And to always be explicit about how the results were derived and the kind of background information We have to support this. Step 6, review the process and analyze its strengths and weaknesses and improve it in iteration. So just revise according to scoping and start again all over again. So you can see in this diagram how there's this sequence of iterations from going to step 1 to step 6 and starting all over again in step 1. To wrap up, I would like to finish with IPBES principles on valuation and values assessment to take into account these diverse conceptualizations of values. To genuinely understand the plurality of values of nature, nature's benefit to people, and a good quality of life, this entails 2 key principles. First is acknowledging the broad range of worldviews, expressing and respecting the plurality of values through which people ascribe meaning and importance to nature that often coexist in conflicting ways. Orchestrating of different notions of value and valuation methods rather than focusing on narrow dimensional lenses. But also overcoming paralysis in the face of this pluralism by engaging into bridging, mobilizing interdisciplinary collaborations between a broad range of natural social sciences as well as different steps. The second principle would be recognizing value-laden decisions. The adopted approach to valuation and to the assessment depends on people's particular ways of thinking, their perspectives, and the way they influence their interaction with nature. This is subject to manipulation from power relations and from the politicization of such relations associated with a particular socioeconomic institutional context. All steps of evaluation and assessment are somehow value-laden, and to some extent, these political choices can be difficult to subtract from the purely technical aspects involved in evaluation or assessments. I would like just to acknowledge the contributors to the guide. The leads of the guide are members of the IPBES Multidisciplinary Expert Panel, or MEP, and the Bureau. Then experts were selected through IPBES processes from a wide range of disciplines and countries and also institutional contexts. Then expert reviews very significantly enriched the manuscript, and resource persons and contributing authors were invited to contribute to specific areas. Also, a team was coordinating and providing technical support. The work on IPBES on regional and thematical global assessment is ongoing, and values are going to be actively being integrated into them. For that, IPBES has created a core values team and has established a technical support unit on values to help in the process. If you want more details, the IPBES value guides can be found on the IPBES website. You have the address there.
Okay, thank you so much, Patricia. It was a very interesting presentation, and I think now that we will jump right ahead into the questions and answers session. The first question that we have received reads, are you considering rights-based approaches to the value of nature, such as the rights to nature approach?
Yes, of course. You might remember when I showed, I can show you here. It will go really quickly, sorry, and then, yeah, there we go. Oops, it went too fast. So if you see in this table, We show the values of nature and non-anthropocentric values, and for particular emphasis, we are emphasizing all the values attributed to the rights of different organisms.
Okay, thank you. And then on to the next question. How can you remove the perception that the IPBES formulation of conceptual framework is too theoretical?
Well, we are working on this. So on one hand, we are working very directly through this IPBES core values team and the TSU with the authors and of the assessment, but also from the TSU, we are working on producing web interface that will be very easy to use by practitioners, that will help them understand not only these concepts in a very practical and easy way, but also to show concrete examples of how this diverse valuation has been integrated into a range of policy decisions.
Okay, thank you. And now we have a question from a coming lead author in the upcoming global assessment. How can we go about integrating incommensurable values? If we do this, they cease to be incommensurable, right? So in light of this, how can this be done in a way that is legitimate for all relevant stakeholders?
Yes, so the technical details, I will have to go back to the guide, but we have definitely addressed this. So there are different perspectives. On the one hand, you want to visibilize, right, these different values and to show how incommensurable they are and how very contrasting they are, as well as which stakeholders are attached, related to each of these values and the power relations among them. But on the other hand, in some cases, you may want to bridge. Bridging doesn't mean that you integrate everything into an index, but it means that you identify the commonalities and the differences. Finally, the integration itself is possible through these methods I quickly described a while ago. So there are deliberative processes, integrated modeling, multi-criteria analysis, and narrative analysis provide very different approaches. In deliberative approaches, it's really about these different stakeholders talking about these different values and in a deliberative way try to understand what emerges from the collective. In integrated modeling, it's really about integrating these different values using an analytical tool. As you know, in multi-criteria, it'll just be using these different dimensions and understanding how they relate to each other. And narrative analysis can certainly provide understanding the different narratives of these different values and how they relate to each other.
Okay, thank you, Patricia. And the next question, somewhat or quite related, how to assess socio-cultural intangible values. I don't know if you have anything you feel you would like to add on that.
Well, that's a different part. Yeah, that's a bit different. So when in this guide also, when we start the process of just acknowledging the different values and documenting these values, there's also a whole section on this. So basically, what do we do? There are very different techniques. So some techniques have to do with all these interviewing and so through the process of interviewing, you can either show pictures that unravel many dimensions. You can also use these deliberative processes to in community discuss about things, and you analyze the context of these narratives. There's other ways that I can't remember, but definitely this has been addressed by anthropologists and social scientists in general. And so there's really a wide range of methods that allow also even to rank the relative importance of these values, either in individual interviews through methodologies to rank this relative importance, or in the deliberative context.
Okay, thank you so much. And then as the next question on my list reads, thank you for the presentation. I am an environmentalist and expert over 20 years. I found the methodology very complicated to use by different stakeholders. The approach in general for environmental issues is the diagnostic, and after we can involve the values concept. I think if we put many different methodology to assess, it will be very difficult for non-environmentalists to use the guide we need to simplify it, to lobby, or to use in education. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, we totally agree. And the guide has really evolved during its different phases, and the current version of the guide is a bit more digestible, but we do understand that it's still quite complex to use. So there's different levels. The guide was aimed at informing the IPBES assessments. And what you're talking about is using the guide to informing actual valuation and policy making processes. We totally aspirate to get to getting to a point in which you can use this approach into policy making, but we understand that right now it can be hard to understand all this diversity, and it will be important to have very different examples of how these different steps can be applied in different ways within different contexts. So we are working on this, and we hope to have a platform, as I was saying, that would really be useful for the context you are talking about, to really identify the tools and the very practical recommendations for doing this. The guide was rather aspirating at being very comprehensive to show the diversity of approaches, but we need a much easier way to maybe through these platforms where you identify your context and have a decision tree on which methods to use. But we are working on developing this platform.
Okay, thank you. So moving ahead, how to value the unvaluable services in assessments?
Okay, so these values that we tell unvaluable, well, I wouldn't say unvaluable. They, of course, are not amenable to economic valuation, but that doesn't mean that they cannot be understood using a set of methodologies I just told you about a few minutes. The important question you are making is different. In assessment, how can we take this into account? So basically, we have identified ways in which you can search the literature, and you can identify within this anthropological and social literature, within the literature more on IELTS knowledge, trying to assess what kinds of values are found in different contexts. And so it has to do with this literature review, and it also will have to do with an assessment of the dominating narratives within these different contexts that refer to these values that are not amenable to a single number or a price in US dollars.
Okay, thank you for that. The next question reads, how to make biodiversity and ecosystem services add value to key knowledge of psychology, so to bring social involvement?
Interesting. We did have a psychologist in the team, but we didn't get there. But definitely there's a lot of research from environmental psychologists on one hand, and on the other hand from people working on ecosystem services, to understand this interface. So there's an ongoing research, very active domain along these lines, really trying to understand the psychological impacts of nature and these implications in decision making. So there's some of these revised in the guide, but in the last 3 or 4 years, there's really a growing amount of publications coming from different perspectives, either from the psychologists or more people, social scientists and people working on ecosystem services.
Okay, thank you, Patricia. Moving on, the next question is about how we can think about what the bearer of value is. And the question reads, the diversity that will need to be captured in the IPBES assessments is as much about the diversity in values that we are attributing to something as it is about ontology. What is it that we actually value? How can we address multiple ontologies in the IPBES assessments?
Absolutely. We get into this in chapter 2 on the guide and somehow show example how to operationalize this in chapter 3. So absolutely, it is about very different ontologies, very different approaches of what is valued and then on epistemology on how to value. So absolutely, and this would need to somehow be addressed in the assessment. I don't think they have been already been addressed as such in the regional assessment. I did go through many of them, but I think we need to work together on how to operationalize this for both the regional, the thematic, and the global assessments.
Okay, thank you, Patricia. The next question reads, some measures and values are determined by national legislation or rules. How do we find an international base or consensus?
Okay, so absolutely, we recognize that norms and rules convey many different values, right? Many principles that are built into these rules. So understanding this diversity of values within different contexts might be important for developing a joint approach to these global values. But for instance, for now, what we have is the importance of recognizing these very contrasting perspectives. And within the global assessments, we probably will need to find ways to think about what would be needed from a global perspective to be respectful of this diversity and to be inclusive in integrating it.
Okay, thank you again. And then moving on to the next question. There is someone asking, do we have university courses and training on this new worldview of value?
Interesting. I'm not so sure. I think little pieces of these are available, of course, in a wide range of programs because all of these methods for evaluation and integration have already been developed in all these different contexts. But this wide-ranging perspective and integrative view is developing quite recently. So at the moment, I'm not aware of any of such program. Myself, I don't integrate this unless like in a few classes, but not as a whole course or a whole program. But I think that would be really interesting, and that will be one important part of the consequences of this guide into capacity building.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, the next question asks, in your finishing note you mentioned that we shouldn't narrow dimensional lenses, but how is this possible in a market-based society where capitalism capitalism is the dominant driver. What is your opinion on this?
Well, that's a bit what we wanted to show, remember, in the two-panel diagram. We are totally aware that this economic valuation is dominating the lens through which the world is seen. But on the other hand, we showed what would be the positive consequences of this diverse valuation. So I really think the fact that IPBES, being a global platform addressing this diversity of values, is already a huge step towards the recognition of this. Of course, we need to work much more on visibilizing the results of the different assessments that would have then integrated the importance of this diversity, and to visibilizing some success stories that would be easy to understand. But of course, we have the power relations, right? We have been talking about. We understand that they're important power relations, that we need to acknowledge they are there and find ways around to communicate and maybe change some of the perspectives through the work by IPBES.
Okay, thank you, Patricia. We also have someone asking, what is IPBES' attitude towards biodiversity offsetting, which is based on valuation of biodiversity ecosystem services? Is it included in the assessments?
So we have this, I cannot remember right now whether it was, I think it was explicitly addressed in the values guide. I cannot remember where it was explicitly addressed in the regional assessments, but there's definitely a very important point. But in a recent workshop that was also linked to the work on IPBES on values, where we're talking about these relational values, these relationships with the value of the relationships with nature and so on, we discussed the importance of this perspective and their implications for this offsetting. So biodiversity offsetting could be, is a useful mechanism within particular conditions, but if we really understand all the relational values attached to this particular biodiversity in a particular site by the local people, then it's not so easy to find ways to offset this diversity. So there are trade-offs, and it's an important point to be mindful and have it at hand when we discuss the further step for the assessments to explicitly address this issue.
Okay, thank you, Patricia. We'll see if we have time to cover one more question at least. And there is someone asking, why is ocean information so limited in the IPBES biological diversity and ecosystem services exercises? Are you able to say something about that?
Well, yes, the number of experts in with expertise in oceans is definitely in minor proportion than experts on terrestrial, but there has been definitely efforts to include people from these realms into these assessments and to really work with this balance. So I would say it is work in process, in particular with respect to values, for example, the values associated, of course, on these coastal communities and also these ocean fishing, fisheries resources, for example, would be very important in this discussion, and it is work in process to include them.
Okay, thank you. We'll have time for one more question before we wrap up, and that question reads as such. Does the guide identify risks threatening nature values and how the guide can help to get decision makers to protect nature?
I'm not so sure. I think we do address at least this economic perspective of the economic cost of losing diversity or particular benefits, but I'm not so sure. So we can definitely identify this issue as an important one to be raised.
Okay. Let me then say again, Patricia, thank you so much. And I'm afraid that we have now spent all the time allotted for this session, so we'll just do a quick wrap-up for today. Thank you for participating and for all of the interesting questions submitted to Patricia. And apologies for not being able to cover all of your incoming questions during today's session. If you would like to watch this webinar again, recommend it to someone else, or access the PDF of Patricia's presentation, both the presentation and the recording will be posted on www.ipbes.net/webinars. Information about upcoming webinars will be posted on the ipbes.net events calendar and circulated via email once they are scheduled. Lastly, before I let you go, I would like to remind you as well that we hope you will answer a short survey about the webinar that will pop up on your screen once you exit the webinar. With that, thank you both Patricia and David for joining us today. Thanks to all of you who have attended the webinar. We look forward to have you join us again. Goodbye.
Goodbye, thank you.